A surprising question that I often get as a professor is, how can you tell that your theology professor is not that great? Well, I'm pleased to answer it. I'll give you my top 10 signs that show you that maybe this isn't all it's cracked up to be, and maybe you shouldn't be asked to pay a lot of money for this class. Okay, number one, he or she reads from notes. Professors should not be reading from notes. I mean, the thought that somebody would have to pay thousands of dollars to watch somebody move their lips when they read their lecture notes that probably haven't changed much, in years, is pretty hard to take. It's actually not acceptable. And it's not only that, it's not only the fact that pedagogically this makes no sense at all. You're not being transformed. Clearly the professor isn't being transformed, otherwise they wouldn't be using notes again and again. But the other reason is that theology is supposed to be transformative. And what this tells me about the professor, if they read their notes to you, is that they're not in command of their material. And they're unable or unwilling, or possibly both, because these things are connected with each other, to interact with you and to wing it. A professor who cannot wing it on a really high level is not worth listening to. Number two, here's my cheat sheet. Number two, they start their class with a dictionary definition. Oh my word, a dictionary definition. Dictionaries are so massively overrated. All they do is they tell you that once upon a time a word used to be used in a particular manner. It was reported that it was used this way or that way or some other way. Okay, that is not interpretation. That is a low level, epistemologically speaking. Epistemology is how we know stuff as humans. Epistemologically speaking, that is extremely low level. And the idea that somebody would basically say to their class, hey, we're going to do this university class, or we're going to do this seminary class or something, and we're going to start with a dictionary definition, that is ridiculous. And that is a sign to me, at least, if I were in there as a student or as a prospective student, if I were in there listening to that, I would say, where's the door? Well, I wouldn't say it. I would just head for the door. So starting with definitions and categories and dictionaries, it makes no sense. It completely belies the depth and the aliveness of the human experience, which theology ostensibly is supposed to be about. And I just cannot fathom how anyone would do that. And yet it is reported that this happens everywhere, pretty much. And how can that be? Well, we created that culture. Accreditation bodies created that culture. We have to give syllabi to the students, for instance. And I'll say more about syllabi in a little bit. I think I have a separate... Do I have a separate heading on that? I'm not sure. Actually, let's put it in right here. So professors have to give syllabi at the beginning of a class, at the beginning of a course. And there's nothing wrong with that. The problem, though, with syllabi is they are the lowest common denominator approach. You pretend that every student's the same, and every student has the same learning outcome and the same objective and benefits from the same material. It's almost like saying every student surely is just like every other student. What? Well, we won't say it that way, but what else could a syllabus mean? It's a lowest common denominator. It would be far better if we could wing it and be flexible. And now I know people say, but that's a problem for me. I'm a note taker. I like bullet points. I'm this personality, or I'm that kind of learner. Well, if we're really interested in learning, it has to be a transformative experience. And to my knowledge, and I know a little bit about accreditation. I was a dean. I started a graduate school. I got stuff accredited. I was dealing with accreditors the whole time. I know the game. I did it in different countries and so on. You look at syllabi, any which way you want to turn them, they are lowest common denominator stuff. they're not worthy of nearly as much attention as they're actually getting. So if professors are into dictionary definitions and slavishly following the syllabus, and in connection with the first point I made about reading notes, this is bad news. Number 3, they're beholden. Now I'm talking about theology here, okay? Though this actually applies in other areas too, but let's stick with theology right now. They are beholden to crazy ideas, crazy doctrinal ideas. So for instance, if somebody comes up with some idea whereby we can supposedly talk literally about the transcendent, and a professor goes along with that and perpetrates that kind of epistemological travesty, that's a serious red flag. If you don't quite know what I'm talking about, put a comment down there and I'll respond to you. And the point is essentially this. As humans, we're limited. We call the transcendent precisely because it's above our pay grade in terms of how we know stuff. So the problem is not that. The problem is if we deny that, if we're in denial, it's called fundamentalism. And if we're in denial about that, we're gonna pretend that we can go beyond that, above that, and speak literally, supposedly, about the transcendent. And if we want to make things even worse, we then want to impose that onto other people. And the utter superlative of all of that is when we get judgmental towards others who are seeing right through this and who have a problem with it and who don't accept it. But we self-righteously somehow think in our entitlement that, we are right and they are under, I don't know, theologically under some sort of judgment or something like that. Number 4, a professor has a problem with dissent. I love dissent. And the reason I love dissent is because it creates conceptual space within which transformation can actually occur. If you have a bunch of people who are full of confirmation bias and who possibly don't even allow dissent, there cannot be learning. The people who always hang out with others who have a similarly narrow outlook on life, they are basically saying, without probably realizing it, I'm guessing, that they are not really interested in being transformed. They're not really interested in being challenged by a truth that may not fit their prior understanding, their pre-understanding of truth. And if people are too, if people have a problem with dissent, and they use their rank as a professor to protect their little truth domain, that's a big problem. Run is all I say. By the way, hopefully you won't end up in a situation where you have to run, because as you're contemplating going to theological school, hopefully you're talking to the admissions people and you're saying beforehand, and you may not know this, but do it. I firmly recommend this. Say to them, hey, I want to come and I want to sit in actual classes. I want to see at least recordings of actual classes at a minimum, so that I can see what kind of professors I will actually get. Okay, so that was number 4. Number 5. Before I go to 5, one more thing. By dissent, I don't mean to invite stupid dissent. I mean, sometimes, I get people who kind of set me straight. And they don't know what they're talking about, or the most dangerous ones in some ways are the ones who know a little bit, but they think they know a lot. That's in some ways kind of the trickiest, because they construct their own world of knowledge. And if you don't fit it, they are fundamentalist enough, while thinking they're terribly progressive. They're fundamentalist enough to think that you need to be taught how to fit into their universe. I mean, that is the worst. Okay, but that's not what I mean by by fruitful dissent. Fruitful dissent is when you enter that conceptual space where transformation can actually occur. And as a professor, you've got to welcome that. If you don't welcome that, if you can't do that, if you feel threatened by it, you are in the wrong profession, period. Number 5, you cannot, or the professor we're talking about, the hypothetical professor, but they're everywhere, they cannot integrate with other disciplines. How can you test that? Well, ask them if they are interdisciplinary. And a professor has got to be able to answer that well. And if they can't, there's a problem. Now, I'm telling you that a lot of professors, when you ask them that, first of all, they're going to be kind of a little stunned in theology, even in theology, I should say. And secondly, they are going to construe disciplines, academic discipline, academic areas. They're going to construe it in the sense of silos, there's systematic theology and there's philosophy and there's practical theology, New Testament and this, that, and the other thing. And they say they know a little bit about any of those. That's not what I mean. That is not good enough. That is not interdisciplinarity. So what I'm talking about here is that when people cannot integrate across the boundaries of proper disciplines, boundaries that probably shouldn't be boundaries at all, but they are boundaries, and professors who accept them as such are showing by that very fact that they're not up to it. So what I mean is a professor who cannot explain how they tick, if you will, philosophically, how they tick theologically, whether they are narrative, whether they're positivists, whether they're critical realists or whatever, who do not understand the nature of knowledge in that manner, I would stay away from them. How can you know these things when you're an aspiring student or an actual student, but you're kind of early on in your journey? Well, we can talk about that. Put a comment in there and we'll talk more about that. This is just an overview, but that's number 5. It would be great if we could test professors, and the thing is, professors don't test each other mutually. They just don't. It's some sort of hidden code that you don't do that, which is a problem, which is why I always suggest we need to get professors of different opinions in the same classroom and professors of different disciplines in the same classroom. And then we're actually starting to go 3-dimensional instead of just pondering over blueprints. In other words, theory. Number 6. They think that the Bible, I'm talking theology again here, that somehow the Bible is about us today. There are so many people who think that, but when professors think that, it's inexcusable. When you basically take the text, the biblical text, and you rip it out of its context, and you pretend that it's somehow about us. It's not about us. It was written 2,000 years ago about then and about them. And by the way, the issue isn't really so much even the Bible per se, but the components thereof, because these are individual books that for about 350 years led the lives they were meant to live, these books, namely as individual documents with individual context and so on. It was only much later, it was like 350 years later, that everything was brought into what we call the canon, or the Testaments, or the Bible. And suddenly the game has changed, and suddenly we treat each of these books as chapters, as opposed to what they really are, which is books in their own right. If professors cannot deal with this kind of reality, this is a good one to ask them. If they cannot deal with this kind of reality, and they talk to you instead about the inspiration of the Bible or something, when really you're asking about what does it mean to take the actual original text seriously in any shape or form, if they can't deal with that, they're bad professors, and you should probably not be exposed to them, and certainly not have to pay an arm and a leg for them. Number 7, they are addicted to bullet points and principles. These are the people who they have the PowerPoint up or whatever, and we shouldn't be using PowerPoint anymore. We got much better things, but whatever. That's not a super serious point, but in a world where we have students who are not impressed by PowerPoints, but they're impressed quite rightly by narrative things and by powerful storytelling that has a relationship to truth that resonates with our own social experience. That's what we really want. But anyway, that's for another day. So PowerPoint, yes or no, irrespective, people or professors who are addicted to these PowerPoints, and they always bring it back to the bullets. And I used to do that in my early days as a professor because it gives you something to cling on to until one day you wake up and you realize that's silly. You either go three-dimensional or you can't. And if you can't, you probably shouldn't be a professor. But professors who are addicted to bullet points and principles and who are thinking they're doing you a favor by taking narrative realities, and the Bible, for instance, is entirely narrative. Even Romans that is seen as doctrinal, which is the worst thing you could say about Romans, I think, it would be totally unjustified. But even if you said that, I would come back and say, please tell me the story that is presupposed by Romans, and the story that is reinforced by Romans, and the story that is subverted and challenged by Romans. If you can tell me those things, I have, let's put it this way, my interest in listening to you has been greatly enhanced. Okay, so if people are all about bullet points and principles, that means they're reductionist. And my advice would be run. All right, number 8, I think. They are boring. They're boring. It's unbelievable how many professors are out there that are just straight up boring. But you're going to have to pay for that class as much as for any other class. You have to plunk down your $1,800 or whatever for a semester class. That is boring. And that shouldn't happen. There are many reasons why something is boring. It could be how somebody speaks. It could be that they haven't done their research. It could be that they lost interest. They're telling you the same stuff every year anyway, because the students change, so the content doesn't have to. That's a terrible situation. The content should change to reflect the different student population that you have in front of you, not just every year or every semester, but every week and in every context. And it is really quite astonishing how many boring professors are out there. I don't know how they got hired. I don't know what it is that they end up, with these permanent positions and nobody challenges them. Well, I do know a little bit about it. I mean, part of it is we give every professor their own silo. So nobody really has much responsibility to be anything other than boring. People can do their own thing. We don't go into each other's classes, and there we are again. It's a problem. We should be in each other's classes, respectfully, yes, but also with a view to collaborating, co-constructing. Boring professors, it's the worst. When you sit there and you look at your watch the whole time, or your phone, or whatever, and you think, whoa, I could be on TikTok. That's not good. By the way, I've never been on TikTok. I have no interest in it. I just used it as a silly example here. But if you're tempted to do other things and you're just kind of watching the time, then your professor is probably boring. It could be that it's your problem too. It could be both. But we should not tolerate boring professors. If we can't engage each other and change each other and subvert each other and challenge the heck out of each other, what is the point, especially in theology? Boring professors run. Number 9, I think. They're grading too generously. Now, I have to prefix or preface this by saying that I am not somebody who believes that everything should be graded. I think it's a problem. I think we live in a culture where grades are everything. You review your purchase from Amazon and you and there's just this constant grading of reality, and judgmentalism and entitlement is kind of baked into our societal interactions. That's not what I'm arguing for. I think there should be plenty of scope for doing stuff that is not graded, especially in theology. However, if you do grade, then you might as well make it stick. It's hard to have much respect for this approach that basically says, well, I assume that every student is an A student, and unless they kill their spouse, that's what they're going to get at the end. Okay, so I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you see my point. We have to do better than that. Grading too generously, you might as well not do it at all. In fact, there would be less damage if we didn't grade at all. Some of the people who might disagree with something I say, which I always welcome. All my career I've welcomed that, but some of the people who come and disagree with you with something you say, their sort of bloated sense of self-confidence is often due to inflated grading. And I think if you are going to grade, and I already said you don't have to, grading, I think, should be optional. There are many situations where it really doesn't make much sense to attach a grade to something that is supposed to be transformative. Grading transformation, that's a pretty ridiculous notion in many ways, but my point is there are also cases where grading makes sense, but if you're going to do it, then do it well, and don't do this thing where you say everybody starts at 100% and then they work their way down from there to maybe 93 or whatever, and if they dip to 89 they're going to complain to you about it. That's a crazy culture, and that's the culture I think that we have by and large, and it needs to be challenged. And a good professor will buck the trend, and a good professor will not be held to standards that are nuts and too low. And I already explained to you, I think, what I mean by that. All right, that was number 9. And finally, number 10, how can you tell you're dealing with a bad professor? Well, in the area of theology, one of the worst things, and I see this a lot, and it's a complete giveaway as far as a professor not being up to it, is when a professor goes to certain biblical books and somehow in an imperialist fashion, takes over the book, rips it out of its context, while having no sense that that is actually what's occurring. That's kind of the kicker in this. And then turning it into some kind of leadership manual. It could be the book of Joshua, it could be the book of Nehemiah. That's an all-time favorite amongst people who do that kind of thing. They go to the book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament, which is a perfectly good, beautiful, riveting narrative, and they turn the thing into leadership principles. Now, there are many ways you can destroy a text, but two things about that. One is you'd never do it to Shakespeare. So why do you do it to biblical documents? But secondly, if you're going to destroy a text, do you have to be so cynical as that? Basically completely ignoring the actual communicative action that is happening in the text and replacing it with your personal leadership idolatries. Did I say idolatries? I guess I did. All right, so those are my top 10 ways of telling that quite possibly you're dealing with a terrible professor in theology, and maybe it's time to get out.